Welcome to the first aside. An aside is a lecture that isn't necessary to watch. It's more of a bonus lecture for more information about a particular topic. You're free to skip these lectures and come back to them after you finish this course. In this first aside lecture, I'm going to show you how to create a walker class. In the previous lecture, I talked about how to create a menu using the WP-Nav menu function. This function has one extra setting you can set, which is the walker key. Before we get into how the walker key works, let's talk about walkers in general. Walkers aren't specific to just WordPress. Walkers are a general programming technique. Basically, they are a class or function that takes care of looping through an array. What's so special about walkers is that they will loop through nested arrays as well. It doesn't matter how deep an array is. A walker will loop through every value. It's simple as that. Now that we understand how walkers work, let's create one ourselves. Just like everything else, we're going to put this code in a separate file. Inside the includes directory, create a file named custom-nav-walker.php. Inside this file, I'm going to create a class named ju_custom_nav_walker that extends the walker nav menu class. Alright, at this point, you may be wondering, why are we using classes? Well, walkers can only be created using object-oriented programming, so using regular functions won't work. If you need to, pause this video and brush up on your object-oriented programming before proceeding. The walker nav menu class we just extended takes care of the heavy lifting for us. I'll talk more about this class and what it does soon, but for now, let's use this class. Even though it's empty, it'll work as is. Back inside the index template, search for the menu we created. This array we pass into the WP nav menu function has an extra option called walker. Add that in now. The value for this must be set to a new instance of the walker class we created. In this case, it would be ju_custom_nav_walker. This won't work just yet. This is because WordPress doesn't know where to find this class. Inside the functions file, include the walker class file. Now that we have that set, let's refresh the home page and see the final result. If everything worked, then you should receive no errors and see the menu working normally. While it may not seem like it, WordPress is using our walker class to generate this menu. Even though our class is empty, the class we're extending comes with some default stylings and formatting which is similar to WordPress's default menu. With that being said, leaving it like this isn't practical. The point of creating a walker class is to customize the menu, so let's do that now. Back inside the class, I'm going to create a public function called startLevel. I'm also going to add in some parameters. WordPress allows you to override the 4 functions inside the walker class. Each of these functions determine when certain HTML is outputted. We'll go through each of them one at a time. The first function is the start level. This function is called when WordPress begins looping through a nested array. This function is passed in 3 arguments. The first argument is the output. You'll notice I'm prefixing this with an ampersand symbol. This value is being passed in as a reference. Usually, you would be provided a unique value, but since this is passed in as a reference, then we're not provided a unique value. Instead, any changes we make to the output variable will change any instances of the output variable. You'll see that affects us soon enough. Moving on, the second argument is the depth. This is the depth of the menu being generated. Right now, our menu has a depth of 0 as there are no submenu items. Lastly, the third argument is the arguments. This will be the values you pass into the WP nav menu function. This gives you complete control over your menu. You can choose to use or ignore the values you pass in. Now that we understand the basics, let's use this function. In most cases, you would just echo out the elements you want to be outputted, but that's not the case here. Instead, you have to make changes directly to the output variable to properly output HTML. I'm going to keep things simple and set the output variable to hello. This is the incorrect way of doing things, but that's fine for now. This is just an example. I'm going to save my changes and refresh the page. After some time, you'll notice that nothing really changes. Our menu is still displaying as normal. This is because the Walker class only gets applied to nested menu items. First level menu items don't use the Walker class at all. It's only when you have sub-menu items is when the Walker class will be used. Right now, I don't have any sub-menu items, so the class will not be used. Let's change that. I'm going to open the WordPress admin dashboard and navigate to the menus page. On this page, I'm going to quickly add a sub-menu item to any of these main level menu items. Make sure to save your changes before proceeding. Once that's done, refresh the page one more time. If you look at the menu now, you'll see the hello message being outputted. This will also break the menu and page, but that's fine. Let's go back to our editors. Obviously, this isn't the proper way of doing things. Something I want to note is that whenever you make changes to the output variable, you should always append the value rather than assigning a new one like we're doing here. I'm going to change this into an unordered list tag and append the value. The reason I'm creating an unordered list tag is because this function is called when the menu is about to be generated. This function gives you the opportunity to set things up before the actual menu is created. You'll notice I'm not closing this tag either. Since we're setting things up, we don't want to immediately close the tag. Before we see this in action, I want to make sure WordPress is using this Walker. So I'm going to add a class named special-class. This class isn't specific to WordPress or my theme. It's just a class I made up on the spot. With that set, refresh the page and see the final result. The page should now be displaying normally. Even though we didn't close the unordered list tag, WordPress defaults to an unordered list anyway, so it closes it for us. If I hover my mouse over the submenu, you'll see it appearing normally. I'm going to right-click and select Inspect. I want to see the HTML. As you can see, the Walker class is being used for the submenu because we have this unordered list tag being generated with the class we specified. That's great. We now have more control over the menu and can assign classes, IDs, attributes, etc. Let's learn how to control the rest of the HTML generated. Back inside the editor, I'm going to create a public function called endLevel. Just like last time, we're passed in the same arguments with the same values. However, the output variable contains all the HTML from the previous functions. If we were to override this value, then any HTML generated before this function will cease to exist. We'll keep it simple and just append a closing unordered list tag. So that takes care of the before and after. The next step is to work on each individual link. This will require a little more work. Right above, I'm going to create a public function called startElement. This function has the same parameters as the previous functions with two additional add-ons. The second parameter contains the item object. This object contains information related to the link itself, such as the URL, title, etc. Lastly, we have the ID. This variable contains the ID for the menu item itself. This may seem strange, but WordPress keeps track of all menu items by assigning them an ID. You can use this to add special features by using their ID. We won't be going that far, but you are free to use it if you like. I'm going to start things off by appending a list tag to the output variable with a class of special-class-item. Then I'll append the variable arguments and access the value before. You may be wondering where I'm getting this value. The arguments variable contains the values you set inside the WP-nav menu function. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to this function. If you scroll down to the parameters, you'll find two keys called before and after. According to the description, you pass in text that will be placed before and after the link. Since we're creating the Walker class, we're responsible for outputting these values. Technically, we didn't set these values, but it's always good practice to set them in your Walker class regardless. WordPress does provide a way for plugin developers to override these values, but we'll get to that soon enough. Back inside the Walker class, I'm going to append both the before and after values. In between these two values, I'm going to set up an anchor link. First, let's start with setting up the href attribute. Inside this attribute, I'm going to set the value to item URL. The item variable contains information about the specific menu item in the loop. It's an object where one of the properties is URL. If you're curious on how I know these values, then you can just use the printr function to output the data. If you never know what values a certain object contains, then I always recommend you just output it. Moving right along, let's add the text between these two tags. I'm going to output the link before, link after, and the title itself. Like before, the link before and link after are values that can be set inside the WP-nav menu function. The title comes for the item object. That's all we need to do for the opening element. You'll notice I'm not closing the list tag. That shouldn't be done here. Instead, we'll need to create a public function called endElement. This function's purpose is to close the element, which we'll do by closing the list tag. That's it. We're finished with this class. There's a whole more we should do, but I'll cover that soon. This is usually the minimum setup you'll find yourself doing. Let's go to the home page and refresh. After refreshing, you should see the menu working as usual. If you inspect the element, then you should see that the special class item class is being applied. Not only is it applied to submenu items, but it's also being applied to main level items. To be clear, the start level and end level functions get applied to submenu items. The start element and end element functions get applied to all menu items, including main level ones. This is why we see it being applied here. Now that we're finished with the Walker class, let's explore what else we can do. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the Walker documentation page. This page goes into detail about what walkers can do. Walkers don't apply to just menus. They can also be used for creating other types of content. More on that in just a moment. Let's read what WordPress has to say. The Walker class was implemented in WordPress 2.1 to provide developers with a means to traverse tree-like data structures for the purpose of rendering HTML. This is just another way of saying of being able to loop through a nested array so you can output HTML. Let's scroll down to the very bottom to the section called Related Classes. Here is a list of WordPress classes that take advantage of the Walker class. The difference between these classes and the Walker class is that the Walker class simply loops through your data. It doesn't do anything with it. These classes here take care of using that data and outputting HTML. Let's click on the Walker Nav menu class, which we extended in our custom Walker class. You won't find much written information. In this case, we'll have to study the code ourselves. Click on the link to the file. Here you'll find the Walker that WordPress uses to generate the menu. As you may notice, there's a whole lot more going on than what we had in our own class. I won't be able to go over every little thing, but here's a few things you should know. First, you'll find a lot of \t and \n strings appearing in the HTML. The \t tells the browser to tab the HTML. The \n tells the browser to put the HTML on a new line. These are used for formatting reasons. You don't have to do this as the developer tools already take care of formatting your HTML. With that being said, if you don't use these, then it's actually beneficial to you. By removing whitespace, you're essentially making the file size smaller, which can allow for faster loading times. It's up to you whether you want to use them. The first function here is the start level. Just like in our own function, this will output an unordered list tag. It'll also take the time to check if there should be whitespace, and it'll take the time to apply certain attributes. There are some functions being used here that are WordPress specific. If you're coming to this lecture after finishing this course, then you're most likely familiar with what these do. If not, that's perfectly fine. I won't be explaining these functions in this lecture, but I will in a future one. Keep in mind that this is an aside. You don't have to take this lecture right away. You can always come back to it anytime. Moving on, the end level function takes care of closing the unordered list tag and checking for whitespace. Afterwards, we have the start element function. Just like last time, this will output a list tag with the link inside. There's a whole lot more going on here, but it's mostly checking if certain attributes should be applied. It'll also take care of generating classes. Once again, if you don't understand the functions being used here, then that's fine. You'll learn about them as the course progresses. Lastly, we have the end element function, which closes everything. This is the default WordPress menu and will work in most situations. If you ever need to override the default HTML markup, then you need to use a Walker class. For the rest of this course, we're going to continue using the default Walker class, so I'm going to comment out the Walker key inside the WP-nav menu function. Once you've done that, let's move on to the next lecture. I'll see you there.